Voice America. Live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me. It is the Wednesday edition of Point of View. This first hour, we're going to be talking about faith, spiritual fitness, going to be talking about mental cognition and a number of issues like that. I think you're really going to appreciate the conversation, especially since a lot of this applies to the military. And if you are in the military, you'll certainly benefit from that. But all of us will in terms of some of the things we'll be talking about. I think you'll really appreciate that. Second hour, get back to issues in the news. We'll be talking about, everything from Minneapolis and what is happening there, issues of deportation. But at the end, we'll even talk about some of the economic issues that will affect your family, and I think you will appreciate that conversation as well. But let me, first of all, introduce in studio with me today Dr. Michael Lundie. He is staff cognition scientist at ARA. We'll talk about that in just a minute. He has contributed and led projects on improving cognitive performance, evaluating the interaction between humans and computers and all sorts of things. He graduated from Southern Methodist University, has a master's degree from Georgia State University, and then has his master and PhD degrees in cognition and neuroscience from the University of Texas at Dallas. And Michael, I've known of you, but this is the first time I got a chance to meet you face to face. So thank you for being with us today.
Oh, it's an honor to be a part of your program. Thank you so much for the invitation.
Let me just mention, we're going to be talking about this idea of spiritual fitness, but one of the things I did is post an article that just came out from the University of Texas at Dallas, because they've appreciated the work that you're doing in this whole area of faith and cognitive research. This is maybe sounding really technical, but the bottom line is that you have, especially if you worked with the military, problems with how can we evaluate individuals, whether they will be effective in the military. That applies, of course, to business and everything else. Then how do we deal with individuals that have had traumatic brain injury, explosions and things of that nature, or individuals been in a car wreck? And then what about PTSD? And in some respects, you've been sort of on the cutting edge of all that. Can you kind of explain, maybe in layman's terms, some of the things you've been doing in that regard?
I would say that my work portfolio, it's split between two major areas. The more the classic cognitive neuroscience areas, and just to let our audience know what that entails, cognitive neuroscience is just a very fancy way of saying that you use the most cutting-edge neuroimaging methods like EEG, fMRI. Perhaps your audience might have seen these really colorful images where you see a cross-section of the brain,
yes,
and these little splotches that light up. That's meant to represent blood flow and help to represent which areas of the brain seem to be most relevant for an ongoing task or a thought process, some construct of the mind, be it how we attend to things and focus, how we're able to encode information in our memory and retrieve that later. And so half my work focuses on optimizing those processes as they relate to military operations and for civilian applications as well. The other half focuses more on these nebulous concepts that are a little more abstract in nature, like spiritual fitness. It's something that I'm very passionate about. And there are some autobiographical reasons for that, my own personal journey. But I also think that one of the reasons why scientists have shied away from those topics is because it's difficult to put those things on a scale.
Right.
You can't really put them on the elemental chart of something that you can see, feel, and touch. It's much more oblique, the way you have to get at these questions. But I think it's perhaps most critical to what redounds to dictating or determining the well-being of our lives in a very global sense, whether we have a sense of purpose and a reason we get up in the morning, a sense of fulfillment in our lives. Those are the sorts of questions that keep me up at 3 a.m. in the morning, staring at the ceiling, figuring out how to make some headway on it.
And I might just mention that your undergraduate degree was in philosophy, so you are a little bit like my son-in-law, who actually has degrees in a variety of different areas as well. And this whole idea of brain and mind and philosophy and science oftentimes are separate, and you bring them together. And of course, from your Christian perspective, you do that as well. And I just think it's important to recognize that as we talk about this, you might say, well, I'm not in the military, I've never had PTSD, but I bet you know somebody that's been through some very traumatic events, maybe rape, murder, whatever it might be, and the family. Or again, I've never had anybody explode an IED in my face, but I was in a car accident. My brain's not working. So in some respects, although a lot of what you've done has been help those in the military, and I understand now you're going to start working with Homeland Defense and a few issues like that as well. This is applicable to a variety of different individuals. So just before we get into the outline on this whole faith crisis, I thought I might mention we have posted not only an article about you from UTD, but also a way in which people can contact you because they may want to have you come and speak. But at UTD, they're talking about the fact that you and your major professor and now a colleague have figured out ways to actually enhance the brain, and put it in simple terms, shining light on the brain actually brings about some very significant changes, doesn't it?
So that's we treat truly as a metaphor.
Yes.
It turns out to be quite literal.
Yeah.
The backstory on that is that when I first started at University of Texas at Dallas, I was already interested in the prospect of developing or refining techniques for improving our cognitive processes.
Right.
And the first technique I became acquainted with is called transcranial electrical stimulation. That's just a fancy way of saying you're using electrical fields shining and trying to influence brain activity in a way to where it will alter or enhance someone's thought processes. And so that was one of my early publications. And I thought I was going to go full tilt into that direction, and that would wind up being my dissertation project. And my advisor, Daniel Krozik, he was a relative newcomer to this area as well, neuromodulation. So we were trying to acquaint ourselves with all the different modalities out there. Some of our audience might know about a more mainstream method that's now FDA approved for treatment of anxiety and depression called transcranial magnetic stimulation. And there's an ultrasound type.
Right.
So you have all these different modalities, different ways of putting energy into the brain and influencing brain dynamics. But the method that I have to admit, I was pretty skeptical
The
about
cold laser? Yeah.
Right, exactly. And so there was a researcher named Hanli Liu at UT Arlington, who I greatly admire. She does phenomenal work in this area. But I have to admit, when I first heard about this, the idea that you can shine a laser onto the forehead and somehow that's going to influence brain activity in some desirable way, I thought about it in the same way if somebody came up to me with a rose quartz and said, "This, this helps to calibrate my chakras." Okay, sure. And then I saw the actual results from these studies, the rodent models first, and then in my own life, I used a cold laser therapy protocol to help me recover from skeletal muscular injuries I had incurred through a very long career in mixed martial arts and Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. And when I saw all the benefits that started to incur for my physical fitness, I thought, well, okay, do these benefits stop below the neck, or can they also improve brain activity? And that became our pilot study during my second year Applied Research Associates at my company. And I'm happy to delve a little bit more into that as we explore that topic further.
Well, and we'll take a break, and when we come back, we'll certainly talk about that for another few minutes. But then we want to talk about what about the spiritual aspect, because this is something we talk about every day, and there seems to be a real crisis of meaning. People trying to figure out how to put all of this together, and you really bring both of these worlds together. So we'll talk about that right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
John Halpin is the executive editor of The Liberal Patriot and writes about the demise of religion among Democrats. This significant shift may have an impact on the 2026 elections. The educational shift in the Democratic coalition has been documented in the book, Where Have All the Democrats Gone? Democrats used to be known as the party of the working class, but now have shifted to more college-educated voters located in the post-industrial metro areas of the country. The shift also is a major reason for the rapid decline of religious affiliation among Democrats. This can be seen in the rise of the religious unaffiliated that are often referred to as the nuns. In previous commentaries, I've talked about the rise of the religious nuns nationally, but the share among Democratic voters has more than doubled from 2008 to 2023. Although Republicans have experienced some decline in religion, the impact on Democrats is much more significant. This has led to what some have called the God gap. John Alpin explains that this manifests itself in key issues such as gender identity, immigration, and the role of government. He also says this is a problem for Democrats. He says since that more than two-thirds of U.S. voters overall remain Christian, the increasing non-Christian and secular Democratic Party remains out of touch with a huge chunk of Americans. He recognizes that no one can make Democrats more religious, but they could be more accepting of views they don't share. At the least, they could stop being so hostile to those views. He's identified a problem for Democrats and provides an explanation for the political schism we see today in America that is going to become more apparent in the 2026 elections. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For a free booklet on a biblical view of anti-Semitism, go to viewpoints.info/anti-Semitism. Viewpoints.info/anti-Semitism. You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, Michael Lundie with us, and if you would like to join us a little bit later, we will open up the phones because we are talking about brain function, we're talking about faith, we're talking about spiritual fitness and all of that. And Michael, for just a minute, we will certainly want to get into this whole idea of crisis of meaning, and people are dealing with anxiety and loneliness and depression and all those kinds of issues. And some of those come from the brain, but all of them come from our psychological situation. And the good news is that if somebody is really dealing with some very significant brain misfunction, I guess that's a good word for it. If you've got a better word, I'll take dysfunction. We have some solutions that we never had before. And whether it's magnets on the brain, whether it's cold lasers, as well as all, of course, the pharmacological solutions, that's good news, isn't it?
That's exactly right. And in fact, as you point out all these various ways we can intervene on the brain, there's different advantages conferred by each. So I was just finishing talking about the use of infrared or near infrared spectrum light to improve brain function. So just a little bit into the science here that the audience might find interesting. We all know from our high school biology textbooks that each of our cells have an organelle called the mitochondrion.
Right.
It's the powerhouse of the cell.
That's right.
It produces ATP, right? Drives all the metabolic processes that allow cells to carry out their functional repertoire, right?
Yeah.
So it turns out that each mitochondrion has a subunit called cytochrome C oxidase. It's highly sensitive to that wavelength of light.
Isn't that amazing?
And so it turns out if you emit photons in that wavelength into the brain, the neurons respond by improving their metabolic output. So think of it this way. It's similar to what supplements do for exercise performance, being able to improve or shorten recovery time, refractory periods they're sometimes called, in order to engage a more focused attention type task. And I think we can all see why it would be so important in operational domains of the military, where even just a momentary lapse in attention can be fatal.
Right.
It can result in loss of life for oneself or one's comrades. And so the prospect of being able to arrest those attention failures, you might call them, is highly attractive. And so this is work that's been paying up. That's been paying off quite well. We have a publication in military medicine focusing on that, and we're looking to push that into other avenues as well to see how it could be operationalized or put downfield or downrange for warfighters.
But again, just think about the wavelengths that help with mitochondria. You can think of course, the whole issue of what we call neuroplasticity. We've talked about that a lot because in some respects, people are conditioning their brains because of the cell phones they're using and all the rest. And so you're certainly been looking at the science, but I want to maybe for just a minute come back to your Christian convictions and your philosophical background, because one of the points you made in an outline you provided for me, which I greatly appreciated, was just the fact that we are living in this crisis of meaning. And it does seem to me right now that this is a place, apart from brain science, where the church and Christians can really provide an answer, don't you think?
Absolutely. And there's a very personal story there for me. Just to spare everyone the long, long story, the way I would put it is I've come to realize that life has a way when you live outside of a walk of faith, whatever that purpose is, that vision that God has for you, life will bring you to your knees. And that's the same position as prayer.
Yes.
I came to find out. And that was only a few years ago. I guess I fell into that stereotype for many years of thinking that by being a man of science, that meant I had to somehow have a life that was a separate magistery away from faith.
Yes.
Things that are more abstract, things that you can't really see, feel, and touch. But I came to realize that those are the real fundamental elements that would dictate how well our life is really going. And so I started very intentionally each day trying to live a life of faith, and that has influenced the sorts of projects that I wanted to work on. And to your point about neuroplasticity, the brain will adapt to its circumstances. Think
Both
of our
good
brain,
and bad, yes, yeah.
Exactly.
Explain that.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So
physical fitness. We even train them in some physical fitness. We even train them in some ways in terms of their cognitive fitness, but we don't really spend a lot of time. We leave that to the chaplains or their individuals, their spiritual fitness. And that's one of the things you're wanting to speak to, isn't it?
Absolutely. And this is a couple of years ago where this prospect of focusing on spiritual fitness started to gain more traction. Or at least I became aware of it at Fort Eustis in Virginia, where my colleagues and I went to a conference, and this was the Holistic Health to Fitness Conference, H2F.
Yeah.
So all these branches of the military convene and discuss all the pillars that buttress the warfighters' capabilities.
Right.
So there are certain pillars that are very familiar: physical fitness and prowess. Of course, that's important. Cognitive aptitude, even sleep has gained a great deal of attention, and nutrition. But then what caught my attention in a very positive way was spiritual fitness. And I was intrigued by this. So, well, how do they define this? What exactly do they mean by this? And it turned out they didn't even know. That was the problem. It's like, you know what? The issue with this is that they take separation of church and state seriously. So they want to be able to.
They can't even say what they need to say.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And that's something Secretary Pete Hegseth has pointed out, and when he talked about making the chaplain corps great again.
Yes.
Pointing out he wanted to bring the language of faith and God front and surface that in a explicit fashion, realizing how much of an impact that can make for our warfighters. And
yeah, let's talk about spiritual fitness for just a minute, because what it's not.
Yes.
It's not just going to church. It's not some kind of new age spirituality or something like that. It's much more significant, isn't it?
That's right. See, these might signal that we're on a faith journey to the external world.
Right.
But there's an internal transformation that happens. And it's very difficult for us to wrap our minds around what exactly is happening there. And the way I understand it, the mental picture I want to create for our audience is, when we go through experiences in life, we know life can be cruel to everyone, right? And I think a faith-oriented way of grappling with obstacles and challenges of life is seeing these as opportunities to grow our capacities, to grow in our faith journey. Tests, as we've seen many of the main protagonists throughout the Old and New Testament, they go through horrific trials. And we might think to ourselves, okay, is something going awry in my life and my faith journey if tragedy has beset me? But it might turn out those are the springboards to our development in faith. Whereas someone who does not walk that life of faith, they might see tragedies as breaking them, shattering them.
Right.
As opposed to this being a source, a wellspring they can draw from in order to bless others, in order to be the right person at the right time when somebody's going through a horrific tragedy and realizing they've gone through exactly what I've gone through. And suddenly, as though the constellation of seemingly random events comes together, and think, I was supposed to be here right now. Yeah. I was supposed to be having this conversation. And people who've been through that darkness of life can see something dawn on them for the first time. And I think that precipitates this internal transformation. But the question is, can we make that systematic? Yeah. Are there ways to predict when people will be going through those experiences, when they reconstitute themselves and they put themselves back together, when they're shattered by horrific circumstances or challenges they've been through?
And again, we're going to take a break when we come back and talk about that a little bit more, because you're talking about everything from resilience, an individual who is able to live above some of the difficulties they're facing there, maybe even perspective, to have, a 10,000-foot perspective on some of the things happening, but also just a willingness to understand this idea of meaning, if indeed you start with the assumption that we're just a cosmic accident. It's just mass, energy, chance, and time give us the world. then history is just a record of all these various events that have no meaning. If you believe that history is his story and you have an understanding of that, then that crisis of meaning evaporates because you have a sense of meaning, of calling, and significance. So we're going to come back and talk about that. And if nothing else, if this is intriguing to you, I encourage you to maybe take the time to find some of the material that we've posted today. But also, you might want to pass it on to others, individual, that might want to hear this or see it. You can go to our website, pointofview.net. You'll see that we have a red button there that says watch or listen. Of course, we'll post it at YouTube and a number of other places very soon, and at Facebook, but you can find it right now or listen to it. And of course, you have my Viewpoints commentary. We have all sorts of articles and resources available. And of course, my booklet that we've been making available is still on the website there as well. So if you'd like to find some of the resources, the place to go, pointofview.net. We'll take a break. Be back right after this.
In 19th century London, two towering historical figures did battle, not with guns and bombs, but words and ideas. London was home to Karl Marx, the father of communism, and legendary Baptist preacher Charles Spurgeon. London was in many ways the center of the world, economically, militarily, and intellectually. Marx sought to destroy religion, the family, and everything the Bible supports. Spurgeon stood against him, warning of socialism's dangers. Spurgeon understood Christianity is not just religious truth, it is truth for all of life. Where do you find men with that kind of wisdom to stand against darkness today? Get the light you need on today's most pressing issues delivered to your inbox when you sign up for the Viewpoints commentary at pointofview.net/signup. Every weekday, in less than 2 minutes, you'll learn how to be a person of light to stand against darkness in our time. It's free, so visit pointofview.net/signup right now. pointofview.net/signup. Point of View will continue after this. You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again, is Kerby Anderson.
In studio with us today, Dr. Michael Lundie. And again, if you'd like to know more about him, we have a link to his LinkedIn particular page. We also have this very good article that appeared at the University of Texas of Dallas about his research. And of course, we're talking about this issue of spiritual fitness. And we'll open up the phones if you'd like to join the conversation, 1-800-351-1212. If nothing else, maybe you'd like to take some notes, because I thought now we might talk about what are the core dimensions of spiritual fitness. We've been talking about what it isn't, but can you give us kind of a foundation for what it is and what we need to have in our own lives?
So this is where we get to the bleeding edge of what it means to engage in this work of spiritual fitness. And as a scientist, it's part of what makes it so exciting is obviously there's the operational aspect, implementing this, trying to impact people's lives, but then there's the foundational science of understanding what the constituent elements are of spiritual fitness. And I think some of the ingredients would include things like a sense of purpose, right? And that's an aim that someone can articulate to themselves. Can they succinctly, as though you're riding up and down an elevator with them, could they succinctly tell you what the whole purpose of their life is about? We know that there are models of what a human being needs, like Maslow's hierarchy of needs. This is probably something that's rather familiar to our audience. The basic creature needs of water, sustenance, sleep, etc. The creature needs, but we know man cannot live on bread alone, right? In fact, many of us are willing to forego bread and starve ourselves and live an ascetic lifestyle if we have a purpose that we find sufficient, that we can forego things that we think our bodies need. That shows just how fundamental it is. Then there's a sense of meaning. Is there a transcendent cosmic footprint I'm leaving with my actions? Sure, I can pay the bills. I can try to save up money. I can store up treasures for myself. These more terrestrial ways we can measure success. But then there's also a sense that we can impact people's lives relationally, where we know we've taken them from a dark place to a place of light. And we know those kinds of actions usually coincide with something that's very meaningful, things we want to be remembered for when someone's saying our eulogy, right? And then there's that sense of connectedness. And that's that sense that we're not alone. That's the whole idea of the church. Right. Is that we feel like we are a
community.
Phalanx,
Yes. Yeah.
all working towards a single purpose.
Yeah. Faith community, social community. Of course, I mentioned resilience just a minute ago. That's one. And then you also have humility and repentance. I wouldn't have thought that would be on the list, but that's on the list too.
Harold Koenig has been extremely influential. He's at Duke University, and he is the one who coined the term moral injury. And this refers to a specific type of injury, a psychic and psychological pain that is different than a traumatic brain injury where you can structurally see the damage. A moral injury refers to a sense of guilt, a spiritual wound that someone has incurred. And oftentimes, say, warfighters who are the sole survivor of an improvised explosive event, they feel a sense of guilt that they're the only survivor. Like, who am I to have this blessing of life and not my comrades? That idea of humility and forgiveness, a sense of realizing that your life is not your own, right? Belongs to a higher power, that your destiny belongs to someone else. I think that inclination puts us in a place of resilience where we can deal with adverse circumstances and realize it's a part of our story, it's a part of our journey. And that's why I think these are very important key ingredients that describe spiritual fitness. And the tricky part is how we measure this. Right?
Well, I was going to come to that. You've had your philosopher's hat on for a while. Now let's put your science hat on. The metrics. How do you know and how can you measure where you stand in terms of your faith journey? And in particular, how can we measure how we're doing in the Christian life? Help us out.
So I came across this. I participated in it myself. It had to do with a repurposed. It was the name of it. It was in a previous church I was a part of, and having a sense of where your particular repertoire of skills and abilities, spiritual gifts they might be, and how those plug into actions. Right. It's that Methodist idea that faith and prayer is where the action is. Right. Do you see an actual behavioral correlate with professed beliefs? Faith without actions is dead, right? This is one of the important themes of Hebrews, right? And I take that very seriously as being a guidepost for how we can measure this. It goes beyond how often do you go to church, right? These stopping points or these usual routines that we associate with living a life of faith, as opposed to something that's very personal to their journey. For instance, somebody with artistic gifts might choose to be a part of a worship group. That's somebody who is a living, breathing manifestation of their spiritual gifts. Somebody who is more inclined, let's say, to being highly verbally talented, like yourself, chooses to use his spiritual gifts in a way that honors God. And you wake up every day with that glint in your eye, knowing I'm doing exactly what I'm here for, right? But that represents something that's specific to you, your profile, the silhouette of all of your abilities, all being honed and harnessed towards that purpose.
You're in your sweet spot, as we like to say.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So getting a sense of who this individual is and plugging it into a faith journey, I think is a very key part. Because there are certain ways we can live out our faith journey. They're very general in a sense. Like many of us can go to church, but how does that represent your specific giftings, your spiritual gifts? So one of the tools we're attempting to build here are tools for this introspective journey, having a vocabulary to know how to ask oneself these questions, to be able to figure out, okay, why am I in this position of life right now? What am I positioned to do that leverages or surfaces these abilities that I have to their fullest? I think that helps as a starting point of being able to develop these metrics.
I'm going to take some calls in just a minute, but I thought I may take it to the other side, because the other part of that journey is everything is easy when everything is going well. What do I do when I'm stressed, when I'm angry, when somebody attacks me? Can I love somebody with whom I disagree and who is not very pleasant towards me? That's the other part of that faith journey, isn't it?
It is. And I think many of us are struggling with this right now, especially in the political climate.
Yes.
This is another topic I'm very passionate about. I think that as we've seen, regrettably, faith, the life of faith, the Christian journey He's something that seems like it's more of a subculture as opposed to this being considered almost identical with or the equivalent of what it means to be an American, to love your country. We've seen that politics has rushed in to fill that vacuum, fill that void. And that can create very deep rifts and disagreements that can sever friendships, break families apart. And I think as Christians, we're able to separate someone's actions, someone's behaviors from who they are as a person. That's a very powerful capacity that we're able to bring on board as Christians. I can separate what this person's saying from who they are. And that allows me to have enough distance in my mind to realize I'm not talking to this person fundamentally. I'm not making judgments about this person. It's this person's desperate attempt to get those very same needs met that I just articulated.
Right.
They want a sense of purpose. They want a sense of meaning and community in their life, and perhaps they've gone awry in their
attempt. They've rejected God, rejected religion, but then made politics their religion.
Exactly.
Well, we've got all sorts of questions, so I'm going to see if we can answer some of them. We'll head out to Alaska first. Norman, I think you have a question for Michael Lundie.
Yes, with just a little bit of qualification, I want to just acknowledge that we are body, soul, and spirit, and God begins with us in our spirit as He calls us and so forth. So I want to acknowledge in my own life, or for any of us that follow the Lord Jesus Christ, we know the Word of God is powerful. And in his presentation earlier, I think that the guest has shown that, like in the mitochondria of the cell, it'll respond to light. I think our spirit responds to God's word, and there's a power and a conversion there that when we take in the word of God, just like in John 8:31 and 2, and the listeners can look that one up, but it's one of my life verses for sure. I think that we have to understand how God begins with us and how He sustains us by abiding in His Word. Now, with that said, as a foundation to all of the above, because we are a whole person, my question goes back to the physical for a second to the guest, and that is because I've looked into this for a long time, and there's technologies out there now. One of them is called Life Wave, and these are patches that they put on the body in various locations of pain or whatever, physical. And what they're supposed to do is activate peptides that lead to stem cell healings of whatever inflammation or whatever it is. The other is from a doctor in Dallas, Texas, Dr. Jerry Tennant, and it's called the biomodulator. And it does different frequencies of light to do different types of healing physically. And so has the guest looked into these things? Has the guest ever studied these out? And what are his thoughts about them as like future, scientific methods of, healing in our biology?
Very good. And we are at a mandatory break. When we come back, I see you shaking your head, so you're familiar with that. Also have somebody else wanted to ask about the laser light technology. So you've stimulated some conversation. We'll come back and get some answers right after this.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, Norman asked a good question. He talked about peptides, and I asked you off air because I take peptides, you take peptides, so certainly that is kind of this new cutting-edge area, but it's been something even in your own physical health that's been helpful, hasn't it?
Absolutely. Well, first of all, Norman, I think you brilliantly articulated this layering of who we are as a human being. At the very core, we're a soul. That's the most fundamental aspect of our identity. And I also appreciated how he weaved in something we treat purely as poetic or metaphorical, the sense of the word being light, and realizing how that can make contact with something quite literal. The example
Isn't that
of
something?
Yes, using transcranial photobiomodulation. We were talking about using light on the brain, right? Very interesting. Now, as for the peptides, I think this represents one of the cutting edge ways in which we understand the messenger chemicals of the body and being able to synthesize those so that we can compensate for any shortfall in the production, the endogenous production, that is to say our own molecular factory creating these messenger chemicals for ourselves and being able to supplement those so that we can heal at the rate, say, we did when we were 18 to 21 years old,
right,
when we were at the height of our physical powers.
Mm-hmm.
And some of the injuries I've incurred, I've seen some incredible
You're
results
healing
from
up a
using
lot
peptides.
faster. Yeah,
absolutely.
And really, Norman deserves a longer answer, but I also have a few other callers that want to ask some questions. But let me just say that if people want to have an off-the-air conversation with you, we do have a link so that people can talk to you and, again, maybe have you come and speak, because this is just this cutting-edge area, brain research, cognitive research, but how that relates to the faith and spiritual fitness, I just think is just something that I just wanted to expose our listeners to. And I suspect we'll probably have you back again when you've got some other things we can talk about. But can we go to another caller real quickly?
Let's do so.
I want to head out to California, KYCC. Lee, I think you wanted to ask a little bit more about something we talked about earlier.
Yes, and I don't know if you want to answer it or not. I'm going to ask anyhow. So, basically my life has been flipped upside down. That's the PTSD, if you will. I used to read the scripture, and I could retain it. Oh, I still read it. It's just like last night. I could probably tell you the books that I was in, but I can't tell you what I remembered. God gave me such a tremendous memory of His Word. But since, if you will, the Thanksgiving meals all set there on the table, and the table got flipped upside down, since my life turned out similar to that, I just can't retain the most basic. I'll do something, 10 seconds later, I don't remember. I'm wondering if laser would help me with scripture memory is the most, that I'd love to have back.
Very good.
Is that something that's beneficial, or a peptides, or what?
Yeah, let's talk about that, because, again, you mentioned laser light, and people are going, cold lasers. Who would have guessed? And you were skeptical, but now we have the evidence, don't we?
That's right. And, in fact, there are commercial products available that we can use in order to improve our brain functions. For instance, the manufacturer that creates the devices we use in our pilot study is called Neuronic. And they have a device called the Neuradiant 1070. It's eponymous with the wavelength of light, 1070 nanometers. They shine into the brain at different quadrants with LEDs. One of the advantages of this is it's more portable and much cheaper than, let's say, even when it comes to a safety standpoint, much safer to use than lasers. But to the caller's question, there was a really interesting study. It came out in the last couple of years focusing on repeated head trauma, traumatic brain injuries incurred in contact sports like football, in which experimental designs work, because you want to have an experimental group, and then you have your sham or placebo group. And so those in the experimental group who are subjected to the photobiomodulation or the light therapy showed fewer inflammatory biomarkers compared to the sham group, and presented with improve executive functions, including memory and recall and encoding information that Lee is pointing to right here. I have high hopes for this technology being able to preserve, or perhaps be able to retrieve, some of these functions that can be that can deteriorate after having gone through some sort of insult to the brain, physical trauma, whatever it might be.
Well, again, I don't want to get too technical, but as you get older, there are certain things that are very difficult for your body to manufacture. Collagen is one. I take collagen. Another one, and this is a technical term, but phosphatidylserine, which is something in the brain.
Good choice.
Now, I take it every single day, and people sometimes say, why is it that you are such an old geezer and your brain is still working pretty well? I mean, I've had some people, I was speaking at a seminary a while back, and they said, you haven't missed a beat, and the rest of us are having trouble remembering what we had for lunch yesterday. And that's because I'm in the brain business. And it seems to me that we have the ability now, with certain chemicals or nutrients, as well as certain kinds of technologies that you've just talked about, to help people with brain injuries. And whether it was contact sports, whether it was an IED exploding, whether it's really some kind of concussion because of a car accident, that's good news. And it does seem to me that we as Christians can embrace all of that, because it's not something separate from the spiritual that we still need to be involved with. I think Norma did a good job of talking about the fact that we're mind, soul, and spirit, but at the same time, we are living in this sort of golden age of medicine and biotechnology that we never had before.
It's true. And one thing that's interesting about these technological remedies, or even biochemical interventions that are being devised, is that oftentimes these interventions only really begin to exert a profound effect on our brain dynamics when it's coupled with certain activities.
Right.
So, for instance,
there's the key.
Like creatine monohydrate, there's abundant evidence showing that it improves muscular performance.
Mm-hmm.
But if I just sit down on the couch watching Netflix and just sip on creatine every day, I might say, well, I don't understand. I don't feel like I'm this Adonis the way I was promised. Similar with TPBM, photobiomodulation, peptides, etc. You might get some sort of benefit, but if you plug it into an activity that really pulls our capacities to the limit, to that flow state, that thin line separating the very limits of our capacities to making contact with that margin of growth that we're trying to achieve on a daily basis, that's where these remedies really start to showcase the full extent, the full potential of their capacity. So you can't really divorce the physical implementation, the physical intervention from these other aspects of who we are as human beings that Norman pointed out, the spiritual aspect, right? And I think it's interesting we see that parallel when it comes to our physical prowess, our physical capacities, as well as the mental repertoire and the edge that we try to keep as sharp as possible, even to our later years.
Again, I think the bottom line for what we've been talking about here is it's both and. In other words, certainly you need to be in God's Word, you need to be praying, you need to be focusing on all the spiritual disciplines, but you also need to, at the same time, recognize that we have some tremendous benefits that have come from medicine and biotechnology that also enable those, and the two work together. And separating one from the other is like trying to just drink all that creatine, but not actually going to work out, right?
One of my favorite books I read when I was an undergrad was by C.P. Snow, and talked about these two disciplines of science and literature, right? And the case he was making is that science is dead without the poetic, without the metaphorical, without something that feeds our soul. And likewise, faith is blind if we aren't trying to find ways to live out our faith in physical ways. It's not to say that that's identical with having faith, but it does show that those two magisteria, when they do overlap, that's when we see our faith really come to life and make the greatest impact possible.
Dr. Michael Lundie, we'll have you back, but if nothing else, thank you for giving us an hour today and learning a little bit more about this idea of brain research, faith, and spiritual fitness. Thank you for being with us today.
It's been an honor. Thank you so much.
We're going to take a break, and when we come back, we have a lot to cover in the news, but I hope that this stimulated your conversation. And if you'd like to pass it on to others or listen to it again, go to our website, pointofview.net. Click on that button that says Watch or Listen. Click on the button that says See More, and you can find out more about Michael Lundie. But we're going to take a break. Be back right after this.
Who can you trust? Years ago, many of us could probably have provided a fairly long list, but today it seems we almost can't trust anyone. Educators don't even know what a woman is anymore. Many so-called public servants have shown all they care about is themselves. The FBI has been accused of bias, law-breaking, betrayal, and journalism. It's largely corrupt, with no Clark Kent standing up for truth, justice, and the American way. All of this is why Point of View Radio is more important than ever, and your part in supporting us is more needed than ever. Do your part today in supporting trustworthy truth. Stand with us and help push back the lies and the darkness. Visit pointofview.net. Don't put it off. Take a moment right now and click on that big blue button that says Donate Now. Or call to invest at 1-800-347-5151, pointofview.net, and 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this. Across America, live, this is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
It's Second hour today, we're going to focus a little bit of time and attention on what's happening in Minnesota and then move on to some other topics that affect your life as well. We did, of course, have a conversation, a phone call between President Trump and the governor of Minnesota, Tim Walz, and there seems to be some attempt maybe to step back a little bit. We will see. I mean, always there are promises, but then there's the reality, so we'll see how that unfolds. But I thought it would be good for just a minute to focus on this piece that I mentioned yesterday, but we've posted it for you to read today, because what it is really the first article called Godly Justice and Minnesota, or Minneapolis. As a matter of fact, the whole title is Godly Justice Establishes Facts First, a Biblical Response to the Minneapolis Shooting. Of course, they're talking about the shooting of Alex Preddy, but I thought it was well written by Joshua Arnold, and if anything, it is just a reminder of something we've tried to say on the Point of View program so many times, and that is the need for us to have discernment, and maybe the need for us to have patience and wait till all the facts come out. Just think about what I mentioned yesterday when I did post a piece by Jonathan Turley, who, by the way, is a professor at George Washington University and would be self-identified as a liberal. By the way, he has a new book coming out, Rage in the Republic, and yesterday I mentioned his other book on free speech. I'm sure to get that book when it comes out, but he wrote a piece called Clickbait, How the Left Created Yet Another False Story to Trigger Outrage, and this is, of course, the story of the 5-year-old boy who is referred to as the bait boy. And you had in his article all sorts of leaders, all happen to be Democrats, expressing their outrage about something that didn't happen. And again, the true facts, if you're not familiar, were the fact that this story is that this boy was used as a bait to try to get the husband or the father, but the real facts, as we now know, are that 5-year-old was abandoned by his father in the freezing cold. So the ICE agents took the 5-year-old to the door of the home to actually have the mother take him in, and she would not open the door. Even they assured her that they were not going to do anything for her, but nevertheless, they had to eventually take care of the child, took him to McDonald's, fed him, played his favorite music, took care of him for a while. Eventually, the father asked for him to join the detention facility, but here, again, had nothing to do with that. And, of course, Jonathan Turley has pointed out that this reminded him of something that happened 5 years ago, in which you had all the Democratic leaders expressing their outrage about the false story that border agents were whipping migrants in Texas. You might remember that story, although it's 5 years ago. It probably has faded from the memory of many. And at the same time, I mentioned another piece that came out by Cal Thomas, in which he again addressed this issue of the 5-year-old boy that supposedly was used as bait to get the father, and then points out that now that we know the facts, he said, reporters rarely question the promoters of a false narrative whether they'd like to apologize for what they said. They just move on. And he says, this is a good example of what we call false narratives, or these false hoax that are out there. And he used all sorts of examples. Hands up, don't shoot. That one was tied into, if you might remember, Michael Brown in Ferguson, Missouri. How many people said that he actually said, hands up, don't shoot? That never was something that was said, and there was proven to be false. Of course, he gives you the long list, the Russian collusion hoax about Donald Trump. Trump is a Russian agent, the Hunter Biden laptop, on and on and on. But the point I'm making, and the point I think these two individuals were making is that we need some discernment, and we need to wait until we have all the facts. These two authors, I might mention, are very far apart in terms of their political perspective. I think Jonathan Turley would describe himself as a liberal who's virtually always voted for a Democrat. Cal Thomas would obviously be described as a conservative who's voted for the Republicans. And yet, even though these are individuals that might disagree on political issues, they all both agree on one thing, and that is we live in this world of false narratives. So Joshua Arnold helps us understand that true justice, he says, as God himself shows in the Scripture, establishes the facts first. And he gives some good examples, but let's again just see what has unfolded on the shooting that took place there in Minneapolis. On the one side, you had 3 hours after the shooting. Just, again, put this in perspective. 3 hours after the shooting, the Department of Homeland Security published an account of the incident, claiming that an individual approached U.S. Border Patrol with a 9mm semi-automatic handgun, and they showed the picture here. Kristi Noem, who, by the way, is now under some scrutiny and maybe will not continue on as Secretary of Homeland Security, but we'll see how that unfolds, said that this man showed up wishing to inflict harm on these officers coming, brandishing this weapon, and he was an assassin trying to murder federal agents. This was 3 hours after it happened. On the other hand, you have hyperbole from the Democrats. For example, Representative Ilhan Omar says this appears to be an execution by immigration enforcement. I'm absolutely heartbroken, horrified, and appalled that federal agents murdered another member of our community. And if you are one of those individuals, like many of us around this table are, that lament the political polarization, there I think you can see it very clearly, when now we know a little bit more than we knew before, but just the complete unwillingness to wait till we get all of the facts. By the way, just before we take a break, and then I'll come back and pick out the rest of this article, I don't know if you are familiar, but you had a situation where Representative Omar was speaking, and a man steps up and squirts her with something. People aren't sure if it's ammonia or vinegar or whatever. They wrestle him down. And given the fact that we've had so many hoaxes, there are people that are now wondering if that was a stage event. And it's pretty sad, but it is true that over the years, at least once a year, I publish the latest hoaxes that have been promoted that turned out not to be the case. And so you can understand why there might be just a few people that even when this particular incident took place and all she wanted to do was wipe her face with a napkin, you don't know what was in that syringe. You don't know what was sprayed. You didn't exit the building. You didn't actually remove people from the building. It just illustrates again that in either case, if it was a real event, there may be some things that should have been done to protect not only a member of Congress, but other people in the room. But if it wasn't an event and it's a hoax, maybe we'll find out soon enough if it was or wasn't. These are the kinds of questions that unfortunately you have to ask. And dare I mention the name Jesse Smollett to recognize that sometimes individuals perpetuate, quote, a hoax on themselves to reflect poorly on the other side. And this, I think, is, again, the problem that we're facing. We are unwilling sometimes to bring in all the facts at once, to have a more sober assessment of them. And thus we'll come back and maybe pick out a little bit more from this very good piece by Joshua Arnold about what godly justice should require. And the first requirement is get all the facts first. We'll be right back.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
John Halpin is the executive editor of The Liberal Patriot and writes about the demise of religion among Democrats. This significant shift may have an impact on the 2026 elections. The educational shift in the Democratic coalition has been documented in the book, Where Have All the Democrats Gone? Democrats used to be known as the party of the working class, but now have shifted to more college-educated voters located in the post-industrial metro areas of the country. The shift also is a major reason for the rapid decline of religious affiliation among Democrats. This can be seen in the rise of the religious unaffiliated that are often referred to as the nuns. In previous commentaries, I've talked about the rise of the religious nuns nationally, but the share among Democratic voters has more than doubled from 2008 to 2023. Although Republicans have experienced some decline in religion, the impact on Democrats is much more significant. This has led to what some have called the God gap. John Halpin explains that this manifests itself in key issues such as gender identity, immigration, and the role of government. He also says this is a problem for Democrats. He says since that more than 2/3 of U.S. voters overall remain Christian, the increasing non-Christian and secular Democratic Party remains out of touch with a huge chunk of Americans. He recognizes that no one can make Democrats more religious, but they could be more accepting of views they don't share. At the least, they could stop being so hostile to those views. He's identified a problem for Democrats and provides an explanation for the political schism we see today in America that is going to become more apparent in the 2026 elections. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For a free booklet on a biblical view of anti-Semitism, go to viewpoints.info/anti-Semitism. Viewpoints.info/anti-Semitism. You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, let's see if we can spend just a few more minutes in this very well-written article by Joshua Arnold. Godly Justice Establishes Facts First, a biblical response to the Minneapolis shooting. And again, he reminds us of the point-counterpoint, and I gave you a comment or two from the Department of Homeland Security, comment from the Homeland Security Secretary Kristi Noem, and then a counterclaim from Ilhan Omar, and of course there's others that are on that list, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and many others. So again, you can read that in its entirety. But I thought it was interesting that after giving us kind of both sides, he points out that compared to these equal and opposite conclusions, he says, President Trump sounded an uncharacteristic note of reasonable caution. Which says a lot right there. The Wall Street Journal said in a 5-minute telephone interview with the Wall Street Journal on Sunday, the Journal reported that Trump didn't answer directly when asked twice whether the officer who shot Alexandria Pretty had done the right thing. Pressed further, the president says, we're reviewing everything, and we'll come out with a determination. Okay, 2 cheers at least for the President of the United States for being willing to express that level of care. Another individual that's quoted in this piece by Joshua Arnold is Andrew McCarthy. We quote from him quite often. He's been on the program with us, and he said, look, this is a breaking story, so it would not be surprising if, as more details come in, early reporting proves to be incomplete or inaccurate. Again, there were all sorts of questions, and if you are like me, going out and looking at videos, we have videos of people saying this was a gun in the hand, this was a phone in the hand. Just the fact that, frankly, we are looking at slow motion screenshots, slow motion screens, as well as screenshots that are difficult to discern, illustrates again how difficult it is for anybody in law enforcement, whether it's the police at the state and local level, whether it's federal agents like ICE or FBI or whatever it might be. This, I think, just illustrates how difficult it is. And if nothing else, one of the things that we see Joshua Arnold saying is until basic facts like these are not only uncovered but proven, any judgment about this shooting is by definition premature. So that's the point. Okay, how do we think about this? Because he says that when we don't have facts, okay, then we shouldn't make judgments. Well, it would be nice to get that to happen. But he goes on to say something I'd really never thought about. He says this principle of waiting for the facts is supported not only by reason and common sense, obviously, but also by the testimony of God's word. And I thought, how so? And he says, throughout Scripture, we find that God's perfect justice is demonstrated, among other things, by the fact that he always delivers judgment in accord with all the facts. He says, first of all, of course, it's not possible for God to judge with incomplete information because he knows everything. But Scripture, and this is interesting, takes care to emphasize the factual basis for God's judgments. He gives you an example out of the book of Revelation in terms of the judgment at the great white throne judgment. He moves on to then talk about the issue of temporal judgment, which we read about in Romans 13 in terms of government, and then even points out the fact that we should all, if nothing else, be really under the lordship of Christ. Proverbs 9:10, the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. So the wiser human governments recognize their status in that regard. Yet he says another conclusion follows. If human governments can err in judgment, and they do, whenever there is a mistake made by law enforcement, a mistake made by a government official, a mistake that results from a flawed government policy, people always say, well, how come that happen? My answer is it's a government program. Governments don't do very well doing very much of anything. But even in the private sector, mistakes happen there. So let's not assume that government is the exclusive realm in which mistakes take place. But oftentimes, because there is probably less checks and balances, less accountability, less transparency sometimes, that is the case. But even if human governments can err in judgment and they wish to avoid unjust outcomes, they should institute safeguards to correct erroneous judgments. And if nothing else, this is the concept of fairness and transparency that so many of us are asking the government to provide. We will no doubt be talking about that on Friday with our roundtable discussion because of some of the issues I know we'll be discussing then. But then Joshua Arnold goes on to say, surprisingly, even the notion of due process finds a basis in God's conduct in Scripture. God is omniscient. He's the Lord of all. God does not need to conduct an investigation or help us understand his reasoning before he renders a judgment, but God does that anyway. As God who reveals himself to us, Scripture records how God does these very things. For example, he uses the example of Sodom and Gomorrah. In Genesis 18 and 19, of course, you have the story of Sodom and Gomorrah. And interestingly enough, it even has God saying, because the outcry against Sodom and Gomorrah is great and their sin is very grave, I will go down and judge them. And then, of course, Genesis 18:25 even says the judge of the earth knew the sins, but nevertheless begins a process so that he can show the people that this is not an unjust judgment. He engages in, if you will, almost something that involves due process, even though God already knows the facts. But he's, in some respects, helping us see that as well. He says God could have justly obliterated Sodom and Gomorrah from fire from heaven with no further explanation to mankind, but he chooses to act in a way that most clearly demonstrates his justice. You can find some other examples. For example, maybe the sin of David with Bathsheba. He says this pattern continues through God's messengers. The prophet, for example, Nathan, tells, as you are very familiar with in 2 Samuel 12, a story, a parable to David, which induces David to then pronounce a sentence on himself. And of course, if you're familiar with that, we have many of those examples. Well, again, this is a 5-page discussion, but I thought it was very intriguing to point out that God simply could bring about justice and God could bring judgment on a particular evildoer or action without even having to tell us. He doesn't have to go through due process. He doesn't have to go through an investigation. He already knows right from wrong. He already knows what has happened. All the sins are exposed to him. But nevertheless, he takes us through that so that we might see that his justice is fair and also sets a pattern for us as fallible individuals who do not have all of those facts to undergo the same kind of conversation, the same kind of investigation, the same kind of due process. And I think it is very helpful in that regard. So he concludes by simply saying this: human rulers should take note. If the perfect judge can take time to show his work, how much more should we as fallible creatures do the same? Government officials should investigate the facts before making judgments, and if they want to be taken seriously, government critics should follow the same policy. One of the things I did not cover with Michael Lundie is the idea of confirmational bias that he's done research on as well. That gets into maybe a whole political issue, and we might have him back sometime. But confirmation bias is where you only read the things that reaffirm you, and you discount anything that doesn't maybe counter your viewpoint. And I think we're all certainly susceptible to it. We try as much as possible to give you different articles, but one of the reasons the other day I actually picked an article by Jonathan Turley, who is probably on many issues disagreeing with many of the things we talk about here on Point of View, and then even today pointed out that Jonathan Turley, a liberal, and Cal Thomas, a conservative, are both saying the same thing, basically, and that is some of these stories are hoaxes, and it's a good example of false narratives that we need to have discernment about. It's a way to sometimes check that confirmation bias that you might have. But nevertheless, this piece by Joshua Arnold, I think it's a great piece. If I were a Sunday school teacher, and I am, if I were a pastor, and I'm not, or if I were a Christian leader, I might take this and make a message out of it, because it helps us understand that if God takes us through due process before judgment, how much more should we as fallen creatures go through due process before we form a judgment? Good piece. Thought it would be helpful to you. And when we come back, we'll get into some other issues in the news right after this.
Where does moral truth come from? According to 58% of Americans, individuals determine moral truth. A quarter of Generation Z says society determines moral truth, and morality can even change over time. Only 42% of Americans believe that truth comes from God. I don't know about you, but I find these numbers extremely troubling. It really is a crisis of truth, and that crisis has consequences. Look at society. Evil is called good, good called evil. People with biblical beliefs are called bigots, or worse, they're canceled. But there is hope. The Bible promises the truth will set us free, and that's why Point of View is relentless in our commitment to the ultimate source of moral truth, God's Word. At Point of View, we know that God's truth is eternal, and if we stand together, we can help more Americans apply His truth in their daily life. Help Americans find truth again by giving at pointofview.net or call 1-800-347-5151. That's pointofview.net and 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this. You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Back once again, let me spend just a few minutes talking about this issue of deportation, how to think about that, and then we're going to get into some other issues, one of which I think you'll appreciate. How much can you maybe expect from your tax refund this year? That is going to be more significant and maybe even have an impact on the election, but we'll see. I mentioned, just as I get into this issue of deportation, that one of the benefits, as I've said before, of you being a supporter of Point of View is, especially if you support us at the Truth Team level, which is $1 a day, $30 a month, $360 a year or more, then you receive the booklets. The next booklet, I think, going out, if it's not the next one, it's the one afterwards because it's already written, is on borders and deportation. What does the Bible say about borders? Actually, quite a bit. What does it say about individuals who violate the principles in those borders, even in the Old Testament? Well, that leads you to the question of deportation. These two articles, in some respects, I probably should have listed them in the references, but they just came out. And of course, I've already written that and already, I think, getting printed the Borders and Deportation booklet. But again, if you are not supporting Point of View, one of the many benefits, of course, is receiving the Outlook magazine every month, but also receiving those booklets. And the next one that is going to be landing in your mailbox, if not this month, certainly by next month, is the one on borders borders and deportation. But I have two articles, one that comes from the Wall Street Journal and one comes from Byron York. And both of these, I think, are very helpful because Byron York, writing in the Washington Examiner, this one by the editors of the Wall Street Journal, recognized that some things have changed. And this might also be something to pay attention to because the editors of the Wall Street Journal come out by saying that President Trump and Governor Tim Walz may be stepping back from the political brink after a phone call Monday that both found constructive. And even though President Trump campaigned on a promise to deport criminal migrants, the worst of the worst, as the Department of Homeland Security put it, the evidence seems to suggest that that has changed. And that, I think, may have an impact in the 2026 elections. Last week, they say, the Homeland Security Secretary, Kristi Noem, posted on social media, "We have arrested over 10,000 criminal illegal aliens who are killing Americans, hurting children, and raining terror in Minneapolis." And again, you have, she told CBS that 70% of them have committed or have charges against them on violent crimes. Well, again, the editors of the Wall Street Journal say, well, it started out that way at the beginning of 2025. 87% of the ICE arrests were immigrants with either a prior conviction or a criminal charge pending, according to the ICE data, which was obtained by the Deportation Data Project, okay? Only 13% then of those arrested at the beginning of 2025 didn't have either a conviction or pending charge. Okay, now, as of October 2025, the percentage of those arrested immigrants with a prior conviction or criminal charge has fallen to what? 55%. From 87% to 55%. And again, since October, 73% of those taken into ICE custody had no criminal conviction, and only 5% had a violent criminal conviction. So the point they're making is that it really relates, and this gets to the other piece in just a minute with Byron York, about the fact that if you are okay with taking out individuals who have criminal convictions or a charge of convictions, that's one thing. If you're okay and you're fine with removing even more, well, you see something a little different. And so the argument being made right now by the administration, which was, interestingly enough, challenged by the governor of Minnesota, Tim Walz, in his op-ed that appeared in the Wall Street Journal, is that they have been cooperating. And, of course, the phone call was all about the fact that Tim Walz says that he will cooperate, and whether or not the mayor of Minneapolis does, well, we'll see how all that happens. And again, the old phrase that the proof is in the pudding, or the promise is one thing, reality is something else, which now brings me to the piece I wanted to bring to you by Byron York, because he asked a very important question, and this appeared in, again, his Washington Examiner, but he asked the question, does America have the resolve to deport illegal border crossers? That's the question, because we have had, of course, this mass incursion, he says, of illegal border crossers in the years 2021 to 2025. Estimates vary, but at least 9 million people entered the United States illegally. Most people use the 10 million figure, but he uses the 9 million figure, so we'll keep with that. He says now a lot of that, of course, has changed with the election of President Donald Trump. But what about the 9 million or more who have recently entered the United States illegally? Would the Trump administration allow them to remain in the country? Well, that's not a question that was asked this time last year, but it's being a question that's being asked now. And that's a question at the heart of the current rebellion, he says, against the federal authority in Minneapolis. Yes, some Trump administration officials have explained that immigration and customs enforcement and Border Patrol personnel are simply going after the worst of the worst. And he doesn't get into this, but I just gave you the piece from the Wall Street Journal that actually gives you the numbers. And now they aren't necessarily going after just the worst of the worst, in part because they've taken out a lot of the worst of the worst. Some of the others have seen the handwriting on the wall and they've self-deported. So this now gets us into a different kind of question. It isn't different for me, may not be different for you, but it is different for a lot of Americans. So let's think our way through this. What about the illegal border crossers who have not committed any additional crimes since entering the United States? Now, the argument always is, well, crossing the United States is a crime. Okay, I got that. But he's asking that question in light of some of the polls that we are seeing, and I'll get to those in just a minute, because he says many of these polls show that a majority of Americans are still willing to deport them, but those percentages are changing. Let's look at a couple of them. One is the New York Times Siena poll that came out in September. They found that 54% strongly or somewhat support deporting immigrants living in the United States illegally back to their home countries. Doesn't make a distinction necessarily about whether or not they have a criminal record or not. You also have one that came out in December 2025. This was the Harvard-Harris poll. It asked the question in two ways. It found that 80% support deporting immigrants who are here illegally and have committed crimes. Okay, 80% agree with the worst of the worst. That means that the other 20% or a percentage of those 20% are the ones out on the streets, don't even want to deport people that are here illegally that have committed a crime. But 54% support deporting all immigrants who are here illegally. So the point I'm making, and the point that Byron York is making, is there's a drop-off, very significant drop-off between, say, 80% that said, let's get rid of all the immigrants who are here illegally who have committed a crime, versus getting rid of all the people here who are illegally. Now, the reason that percentage is still a majority, I think, is due to this. Whether you're a Republican or Democrat, you're seeing the strain that has taken place. Let's talk about many of the cities which are run by Democratic mayors, but they have a lot of Democratic voters who are seeing the strain in those cities due to resources, budgets, even the ability to deal with some of those individuals who have strained the resources in Chicago, in New York, and a variety of other places. And, of course, you have immigration activists working on the other side, trying to say we want to try to liberalize as many immigration laws as possible. So that's kind of going to be where the battle is. And I think this issue of deportation, like the issue of affordability, are going to be big campaign issues in 2026. More to the point, it is, I think, really interesting to quote from one writer speaking about Minneapolis, Mickey Koss, who said, "The local protesters do not want the illegals deported, period. Even if ICE force was incredibly well-trained, wore white gloves, and followed Waldorf Astoria rules of etiquette." I thought that was a good line. And that's the point. So on one side, you have some that say, I don't want to deport anymore. They're part of that 20%, or maybe less, because some of those might have been uncertain. But the 80% of Americans are quite willing to deport people who have criminal charges against them. But I think it's kind of interesting to see that this is where the real issue is going to come. And so will the forces resisting federal law enforcement be able to nationalize this struggle? Will this unfold in other cities, or will there be a resolution and maybe even a recognition that it's probably best to deport people who have criminal records? That's going to be the battle, and I think putting these two articles together helps you see what's going to unfold over the next couple of months. I'll be right back.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back for a few more minutes. Let's talk about your finances for just a minute. And that is, I know it's January, and most of you are not thinking about paying your taxes. After all, they're not due till April 15th. And I have a number of friends that always get an extension, don't even pay them till the fall. Don't recommend it, especially since there is a lot of evidence to suggest that you're going to get a more significant tax refund. How so, you might say? Well, of course, we had the big, beautiful bill, or what is actually called Working Families Tax Cuts Act. Okay. Now, in some respects, you might say, well, why would that be any different? All they were doing is renewing the tax cuts that happened during the first administration of Donald Trump. Oh, yes, but they did a few other things. And so in some respects, there might be even more incentive for you to file your taxes early because you'll get a tax refund. Now, I can't guarantee that. Don't even expect that everybody in the listening audience is going to get a refund. But recognize that you have all sorts of other things that are in the tax bill that maybe you didn't realize are there and thus probably will benefit you. Now, again, I'm all for tax cuts, but I'm also wanting to tie that into spending cuts. And the problem is that, as we all well know, this time last year, there was all this great optimism that DOGE would actually begin to cut back the federal budget, and that didn't really happen. Essentially, they ran Elon Musk out of town. There have been some cuts. Let's give credit where credit is due. The House of Representatives have cut a few things, but not a lot. But that's a story for another day. This is all about something that might put a smile on your face, and that is tax refund, which means that this case, it means money that you sent to the government's had for a year, and now you're going to get it back. And maybe you should reevaluate how you fill out your taxes next year. I know I'm going to. I've always had a situation where I maybe have a little bit more taken out because sometimes I have some incidental income that comes from a speaking engagement or something like that. But most of the time I end up getting a refund, and I wanted to change that, but I think it makes my wife happy to see us get a tax refund. So nevertheless, we'll see where it is. But first of all, let's go to this last article. You can read it in its entirety. It's pretty easy to read. And Joseph Califant says that the White House recently announced that cuts to American tax policy means that families will be getting a huge increase in their expected tax return. Okay, so this gives you a link to some articles that you might want to find. But the estimate is, and you may be above this estimate, you may be below it, but the estimate is the average return should net taxpayers an additional $1,000 increase over their historic averages. Okay, why so? This goes back to the Working Families Tax Cut Act, promoted by President Trump, passed by the House and Senate. And this was, as the White House states in the article, broad-based tax relief for hardworking Americans, with the average taxpayer expected to see nearly $4,000 in total tax savings in 2026. Now, again, that would be suggesting that some of you already received some of these particular tax refunds. But let's think through why this would even happen. Well, don't forget, no tax on tips, no tax on overtime, no tax on Social Security. Now, some of our listeners right now go, okay, there's some very significant things. If you're working, taxes on tips and tax on overtime. If you're receiving Social Security, again, not paying taxes on your Social Security benefits. Also, a deduction for auto loan interest on vehicles made in America. Okay, you got to figure out where that fits. But those are some real benefits there. And so the argument is, right off the bat, that's going to be putting more money back in the pockets of families, workers, and seniors. Okay. Now, this also gives you a link to the Tax Foundation, so you can run the numbers on your own. And first of all, they do point out that the biggest winners of tax cuts will be the middle class and even the upper middle class. And you might say, well, why is that? Well, because the middle class and the upper middle class and the upper class pay most of the taxes. And you've heard me say this before. But again, middle and upper middle income groups will see the largest share of tax filers. Lower income filers with little or no tax liability, in other words, if you're not paying taxes right now or very little, probably aren't going to see as much. Well, again, individuals that pay the lion's share or the massive amount or the significant amount of taxes are going to see more of a benefit. That's why the average means something different depending on where you fall in terms of your income in 2025. But even CBS reported that the IRS is expected to dole out an additional, are you ready for this, $50 billion more than last year's total payout. This is again quoting from CBS. A $50 billion boost in tax refunds would represent an 18% increase from the $275 billion in refunds the IRS sent this year, that was this last year, to nearly 94 million taxpayers who overpaid their 224 federal tax returns, according to the data. The average refund was $2,939, according to the IRS. So again, one of the things that we're starting to see is that this could mean more tax refunds for the country. I'm always in favor of putting more money back in the hands of the taxpayers, that's you and me, and less in the hands of bureaucrats who are oftentimes unelected and aren't really taking seriously the money as much as you do, because guess what? It's not their money. You tend to be much more careful with your money than the federal government, as illustrated by my commentary last week, and I thought we would go to it one more time. Yesterday's, for example, deals with this issue of fraud in taxes. It was the January 26th one, and if you look at the chart, you see that the largest budget in the world is the United States. The second largest budget in the world is China, but the third largest is if you take U.S. fraud and debt service and put them together. And thus it means that if you just take the amount of money that we are wasting and the amount of money that we've spent in the past that we're paying interest on, that would make it the third largest budget in the world. Or, as I point out, there's a real concern on the part that maybe he was using some numbers from Elon Musk. So maybe it's not 20% of the federal budget that's fraud. Maybe it's more like 10%, according to the Treasury Secretary. That would still say that our fraud and debt service would still be as large as every country other than the United States, China, and maybe Germany. Maybe Japan, depending on how you look at that percentage. And so it illustrates again that there's a lot of fraud. And as a result, I'm all for cutting taxes, but we simply don't have the ability, apparently, to cut spending. And that's the problem. It isn't that the government is underfunded. It is the government spends too much. We know that, but the American people simply don't seem to have a stomach for cutting back some of the spending, and that's the world we find ourselves in today. Nevertheless, if you were hoping for a tax refund, the odds have improved dramatically that you'll have a tax refund. If you want to wait till April 15th or even postpone it to, September 15th, fine, but you might want to get your refund now and invest it wisely. That's all we have for today. It is great to have the team back. Great to see Megan. I have both Megans here today and Steve. Steve was doing double duty yesterday, but it's great to have everybody back here as well. I hope that you will look to find some of the articles we've posted, some of the information that is available to you on the website, because we certainly do want to educate you about these issues. That's all we have for today. We look forward to seeing you tomorrow right here on Point of View.
Have you ever met a child you knew would do great things? They displayed remarkable imagination, understanding, and a zest for learning. Now imagine someone takes that child and instead of fostering their potential with a real education, they feed them nothing but lies. You know, that scenario isn't so far from reality. From a young age, Americans are fed a consistent stream of distorted facts, from the secular indoctrination they receive in many public schools, to the biases presented as fact in many colleges and universities, to the barrage of misinformation from the mainstream media and the lack of moral grounding in our society. It's not that Americans aren't capable of understanding the truth, it's that they aren't exposed to it enough. You can expose more Americans to the truth when you give to Point of View, where listeners receive facts, perspective, and biblical truth they don't get from society. As long as we have truth, we have hope. Give today at pointofview.net or call 1-800-347-5151. Pointofview.net and 1-800-347-5151. Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries.